Hello, I'm June Reith, and you're listening to General Intellect Unit. This time we're picking up part 2 of our discussion of Internet for the People by Ben Tarnoff. If you didn't catch the first part, I'd recommend pausing this episode, going back one, and starting from there. As always, thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy the show. We get on to part 2 of the book, which is about the platforms, where we move up the stack in chapter 5, which gets... A big chunk of this chapter is actually, it's the kind of, the mid-90s, the kind of dot-com gold rush and the bubble and stuff, and like the attempt to privatize and to monetize activity in the application layer of the internet.
So not just making money off of service provision, but make money off of the activity that is happening on the internet.
And the premier example here is actually eBay, because it's one of the companies that actually survives the dot-com crash and sort of pioneers kind of a lot of the techniques that would end up being, useful for monetization. Like they were weirdly ahead of their time on some of this stuff.
Yeah, they essentially invent like what it was later called the platform. eBay is kind of like the first platform, where it is like Tarnoff argues is 3 elements: the sovereign, that is the role of eBay as the disciplinarian who says who can and cannot participate in the market on eBay and how they should behave. The middleman, that's basically connecting the seller to the buyer, and vice versa. And then the maker of network effects, which is to say the more people that are selling things on eBay, the more attractive it is as a buyer to use it, and vice versa. And then also things like spinning PayPal out of eBay, which was possible because there were so many people on that marketplace in the first place, right?
Yeah, it's the kind of exponential curve of utility for the platform based on participation. So each new user adds more than 1 unit's worth of utility to the network or whatever.
And the really the key things he points out are that you need to get the users to do most of the work on the platform to lower your labor costs as a platform holder. But you also need to do enough administration and as you would put it, sort of state-like functions, to make sure it is a functional marketplace. So you need to kind of balance those two, and it's difficult to do it, but the back and forth there is essentially what makes the platform work.
Yeah, and there's some really interesting points here about the eBay wanting to fuse community and market, right? This is a proper libertarian kind of fantasy, right? That the community is the market and the market is the community, and that getting in the middle of all of that was highly lucrative. But there was a kind of interesting point about that initially they kind of wanted the community market hybrid to be self-regulating, but then did have to step in with dispute resolution sort of stuff that the sovereign couldn't be absent entirely, which is kind of contrary to the libertarian myth, but is actually totally copacetic with how libertarianism plays out when it's not just a fucking weird fantasy.
Yeah, the guy who created it, Omidyar, he was a libertarian, and he was against the commercialization of the internet, but only because it was kind of too tacky and top down. What he really wanted was to take the early activity and creativity of the internet and like funnel that into more horizontal market transactions. Yeah.
Yeah, that stuff is crucial, right? Because like this is it's the humanization of the internet, and it's the hijacking of human interactions. But it's also like that similar to what I was saying about email being the killer app for the early internet. Like it like the internet ends up being a way for people to interact with each other, and rather than primarily a way for nuclear missile silos to coordinate action. You know, like it's much more of a human place. And that's it's part of, I mean, it's a thing Tarnoff raises a couple of times, right? Like this transition from the internet as a protocol to the internet as a place where human beings do things. They sell and buy and flirt and argue and, you know, send each other death threats and shit like that. You know, all those lovely human things that we do that's the real heart and soul of all this stuff, not the kind of military coordination system that it was supposed to be. Let's see what we got. I think we might have covered a lot of that chapter, actually. Yeah. Online malls, the platforms. I guess this is where he kind of, well, he's already taken objection to them being, you know, platforms, because platform is such a kind of neutral term, and it kind of suggests that, like, oh, we're just facilitating things, you know, we're just a fun little flat surface on which you can stand. In this, as the title of the chapter suggests, online malls, these are, like, that's a much better analogy for what this is all about. It's privately owned public space. I was not aware of the kind of weird quasi-socialist...
The socialist origins of malls.
I know, like, who the fuck knows about this? This is so weird.
Yeah. Yeah, I did know about that, like, from years ago reading about it, but it is interesting. Like, it is interesting how, sort of depending on the country, you see a little bit more or less of this sort of thing. So, like, you know, the idea behind malls originally was to kind of be a response to, like, strip malls or sort of, like, very car-centric, like, atomized marketplaces. And to be these, like, enclosed public spaces that would mimic the activity and values of a European town square, right? And yeah, like, in some, like, in Japan, for example, like, you'll always have sort of, like, community performances and, like, music events and little happening things that are going on in the mall in a way that sort of is, like, reminiscent of what the original idea was behind malls. Whereas I feel like in Canada you see it sometimes, but almost always it's just like, no, it's just a place. It's just a place for shops to set up and for goods to be sold. Like, there's very little of that idea of the town square in it, except for in, like, kind of the old hangout culture that existed in the 90s in the mall or whatever. That was very improvised. But, like, you know, the original creator of malls, I forget what his name was, but his sort of theory was you'd have, like, libraries in there and stuff, like, you know, kind of like more non-profit oriented things existing in the mall space alongside the marketplace. Yeah,
that's pretty amazing, because like by the time we come along, like, all of that shit's gone, you know, like, completely, and it's just this. The shopping mall is this cold, machinic sort of place that...
Yeah, it's just, whenever I go to a country and I look at the mall culture to whatever extent it exists, like, I'm always reading it from, like, the lens of, like, how much does this match up with the original conception, like, the socialist conception of malls? Because I just read that, like, years and years ago, and I was always like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And it's also interesting, like, in Europe, like, for example, in Utrecht, where, I work sometimes, they've built a mall in the town square. There's like a giant mall in there. And so it's like very much like, I don't know, the serpent eating its tail. Like the original referent for what this was supposed to be is turned into the thing that was imitating it in the first place. And people generally hate it, of course, as being like this, like, American intrusion into their public space.
Yeah. Jeez, do you think Baudrillard would have a heart attack if he was still around? That kind of shit. Just fucking...
No, I think he would just be like, yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, probably. He probably saw that coming a long way off.
Like, it's all going according to plan.
I guess that does fit much better with him. But yeah, so like these internet platforms are really basically online malls, right? Like that it's very like, oh, come hang out here and do things and transact and hang around, and also we control everything and we can see everything you do, because on the in a mall you can walk around and it's not like they have sensors in the fucking floor plates or anything, but the nature of the internet is that there's metrics and data collected fucking everywhere, because you can't traverse any of it without giving that signal.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like pre-internet-ish time, you had, like, sort of more digitized inventory systems that came into malls, which is, like, the closest thing you got to that kind of tracking. But, like, pretty much anything you find in a mall that fits that, like, surveillance capitalism model, is a thing that's been like backported from the online marketplace to the brick and mortar mall system. It's like it's been innovated in online marketplaces and then brought to the mall as opposed to like springing up there.
Yeah. This is the notion of like the data rent and like the data as a kind of raw resource that these things collect and operate on. Which we touched on with what was Cernishek's book called? Platform Capitalism. That's the one. Which is cited here as well. So it's all very kind of similar to what's said in that book. That it's all about the data, and that like one of the big problems with like say if you think of like the .com crash, like you had like pets.com and shit like that, where the business model was we're going to be a pet food store but just on the internet, which is like it's just mail order pet food but going through a web browser. Like it's not really a novel kind of thing, right? The thing they didn't get that eBay and Google and all these places eventually got, that they figured out the business model that would actually work on the internet, was to get in the middle of all that kind of stuff and siphon up the data and use that as an additional raw resource. That's why eBay and Google and etc. and Amazon would stick around, but pets.com hit the skids. That does bring us to Google. Basically, yeah, that's kind of the story of it, is that like they make a search engine and eventually start using data on user behavior to feed back into like both optimizing the results in the search engine and selling ads, crucially. And then you can see the feedback loop forming there that starts to tighten over time.
And like the algorithmic sorting of ad preferences is like, because initially the founders of Google are kind of like against using ads, because they don't like ads. But then when they figure out a way through like, what is it, AdWords, the AdWords system, to kind of like auction off ads in a way that will make them more relevant to the viewer, based on like their search algorithm, that's when they're like, well, I guess it's still, kind of providing some kind of value to the viewer, as opposed to the just sort of like, fire hose blasting of advertising that was like indiscriminate and common on both television and online at that time.
you can see the wonderful synthesis of all those different tendencies, right? Like being a sovereign who gets to set the rules, being a market maker in between the consumers and the ad sellers, or the advertisers, I guess, and then having the network effects because the whole system becomes more valuable with more users. And I guess if users feel that the ads on Google are less obtrusive or are higher quality or whatever, it's less odious than the stuff they see on Yahoo or whatever, they'll go there, and then also the advertisers will go there. It's all this kind of multi-dimensional feedback loop that adds up to a lot of money for Google. But the grease at the heart of it all is the data. That's the kind of lubricant and the raw material that makes all that possible. Without the
Yeah, it's the data and knowing how to work the data, right?
right and that's why they get good at machine learning, is because that's how you calculate the quality scores for ads and for user behavior and get all that stuff matched up.
Yeah, and it's also how like the algorithm becomes, it's not like completely out of human control, but it is like more and more an inhuman force that structures human behavior in a very like capital logic kind of way. Like obviously the algorithms are not like intrinsically capitalistic, like ranking search results in a way so that the results are relevant to the user is something that you would probably want to do in any mode of production. I mean, unless you were like, I don't know, a librarian who really wanted to protect your position. And so you're like, well, I'm just going to make the search algorithm useless. So then they have to come to me. But generally speaking, that's just a simple instrumental logic. But like, I think he mentions later in the book that these algorithms obviously take on the prejudices of the of the society within which they are created. And because the whole Google system is geared towards profit making for Google and for the ad purchasers, to some extent at least, right? Like, it's very unclear how much the advertising actually works for them, but at least they think that it's about it's relevant to their profit making plans. And that means that the algorithm over iterations gets tuned more and more towards capitalistic aims, and began with sort of data structures that were already biased by the capitalist society within which they existed.
Absolutely right. And we kind of get a section on Facebook then, and social media, and how all that same stuff applies there with the algorithmic kind of drive of engagement, and it's structuring human behavior towards capitalist ends also. And the chapter does then close on the like a subprime attention crisis, the like kind of looming threat that actually all this advertising shit is actually much less effective than it's supposed to be, and that Google and Facebook make a lot of money because they're the guys selling the pickaxes in the gold rush.
Yeah, but I mean, like, isn't that just like a perpetual problem with advertising? Like that, like everybody kind of knows it's like a massive social waste of resources. But at the same time kind of knows that, like, if you don't advertise at all, you're screwed. It's that weird gray area between, like, this is useless and this is necessary, if not that useful.
Well, it's one of the classic examples of a Red Queen problem, and like for the listeners, like this is a thing that comes from evolutionary biology, but like gets applied to capitalist stuff as well, where in Alice in Wonderland, the Red Queen says something along the lines of, you have to run as fast as you can to stay in place, and you have to run twice as fast as that to actually go anywhere. And in evolutionary biology, this is the concept that organisms or species have to evolve at a minimum to catch up with where everyone else is, because everyone else is evolving to catch up with where everyone else is. So there's a certain amount of wasted energy on just staying in the same place, basically, like just maintaining stasis. And then if you actually want to evolve wings or sharp teeth or something, that takes even more energy. And so, yeah, in advertising, it's a Red Queen problem where you're kind of mandated to spend a certain amount of money on advertising, even if you know it doesn't really pay off, but it's just to keep up with the Joneses at a minimum. And then if you actually want the advertising to be effective, you have to spend twice as much. So it's a colossal amount of bloat and just useless crap that actually doesn't really do anything.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where it's like, even in the socialism, you would expect there to be some kind of advertising, like, just because you need to, like presumably you want people to get the things that you have to provide, but probably wouldn't have this, like, arms race characteristic to it that you get in capitalism, where it's just, like, this massive, massive social waste.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Speaking of social waste, Chapter 7, Elastic Empires, where we get to talk about e-commerce. Big chunk of this is about Amazon, basically.
Yeah, it's about, like, AWS, and it's about Amazon Marketplace, right?
Yeah, right, because, like, Amazon starts out as just a bookshop, and it's like, well, it's mail order books, but through a web browser, who gives a shit? Like, and they kind of, they have a really hard time initially because, like, margins are really thin, and in part because they own their own infrastructure, like the distribution centers and stuff like that. It's not like eBay.
Yeah, they have warehouses.
Yeah, whereas eBay just farms all that out to the users. It's like you sort out the shipping, whatever. We don't give a shit. But like Amazon is actually doing it. But their fortunes kind of turn around a bit later when they kind of become a data company. They start doing this data trick, and then specifically when they do the like market platform thing where they get in the middle of, like, they allow other sellers to sell on Amazon, and then they get in the middle of that stuff and harvest the data from those transactions.
Yeah, they can let their marketplace sellers come in, start selling something, assume the upfront costs, and then they just cherry pick the things that are selling well and copy what it is about them that's appealing, and then undercut the people who were originally selling them.
It's a double win because they get to take a slice of something somebody else is sorting out, right? Like, and they and sometimes they even get to, like, they'll sell you the warehouse space for the inventory and stuff like that. And it's that getting in the middle dynamic. And the network effects are in play, and the sovereign stuff is in play because they get to set the rules. And then,
they can always just, like, totally screw you because they are the sovereign over the quote unquote platform.
And the copycat stuff is crucial there. And then, like, I think their fortunes really turn around when they get into AWS, Amazon Web Services, where they basically they kind of, there's this push within Amazon to rationalize its IT infrastructure to be more kind of like service platform oriented, so that, like, if you're developing internal systems for Amazon, you'll be deploying them onto its own internal infrastructure that's, like, fully managed and stuff, and it's all kind of slick and greasy.
And there's less, like, duplication of infrastructure.
There's one way to deploy stuff within Amazon, basically, and there's, like, it's all, and then you have, I guess, infrastructure teams who are running that sort of stuff. And then it occurs to them, why not just sell this? We'll just sell on-demand computation in the same way that we sell it internally. It's a bookkeeping exercise for us, but we could sell it publicly. And this is a big feature of the internet and of, like, software development these days, is this, like, the cloud, on-demand computing from a magic machine somewhere.
Yeah, 100%. And, like, it's interesting, like, he mentions that sort of, like, in the 60s when the internet was kind of, like, in its total infancy, there were, like, people who envisioned this on-demand computation being part of what the internet would become. And it wasn't until AWS that it actually existed.
Mm-hmm. We're very much back to the kind of, like, mainframe era where you have, like, thin clients, like you have dumb terminals more or less, and then all the smarts live in a big machine somewhere. I guess also, like, with AWS, they've managed to kind of resell their data infrastructure, so that, like, a big part of AWS's service is data storage and, like, machine learning as a service and that sort of stuff. So it's not only, like, they get to be a data business in themselves, but then they get to take a slice of every other data business in the world, which it's a hell of a fucking position to be in.
Yeah. Because, like, you do have, like, competitors, like Azure or whatever, but AWS is the biggest game in town.
There's a section then on basically like Internet of Things and the diffusion of the internet through, I guess, especially through mobile computing, through mobile networks and smart fucking clocks and all this other horseshit that we have to put up with these days.
Oh, it's horrifying. Like, what they're saying is, like, by such a date, like, half of the computers in the world are going to be Internet of Things devices. Like, oh my god, just can you imagine the security disaster implied by that? Like just just this like horrific creaking, like kind of like undead army of machines that is just like it's running like Java 2, and it's like everything is like you can only access it by way of like a proprietary app that's written in COBOL or something. Like it's like just it's so horrible. I mean, like capitalism is just inherent in capitalism to produce like tremendous amounts of waste. But there's just something about Internet of Things where it's sort of like it's like half living that makes it even more like disgusting and abhorrent than the usual forms of capitalistic waste.
Yeah, right. Because the kind of framing here is all like the diffusion of the internet through material reality, like a fucking mold. It's just everywhere and you can't get rid of it. It's fluid, it's ubiquitous and diffuse, like black mold is. Horrible.
Yeah, sorry.
I hate that shit. I want to get it out of my house.
Well, I try to make sure I don't buy anything with Internet of Things.
Oh god, no!
Like
that shit is forbidden.
Features, but like, eventually it's just going to become overwhelming, and every fucking thing's going to have it in it, and it's like. There's no good reason for any of this to exist.
Well, yeah, all that kind of shit is forbidden in this house, but like we might need a new TV in the next couple of years, and it's like I don't know where the fuck I'm gonna get like a dumb TV anymore,
well, yeah, I think like the only thing you can do is like buy like a PC, like one of those like PC monitors that's like enormous, and then it's kind of like headless, like it doesn't have any compute functions on it.
That's gonna have to be it, Just get a huge TV, huge computer to monitor.
Don't worry, they'll add a bunch of crap to that too soon.
Yeah, they'll figure out how to fucking do that exactly. This shit sucks. The chapter then kind of takes a bit of a turn towards Uber and the algorithmic management.
Yeah, which basically tries to take like the AWS idea of like provision on demand and use that model for labor.
Exactly right. They kind of get there by a segue from actually going back to the military and like the first use of basically of algorithmic management when the military finally did decide to use computers to do like what was it, packing planning or whatever for like the load planning for like deployments.
The 18th Airborne, I think it was. Like they basically, it's like I guess a regiment that could deploy to anywhere in the world, and they used to have to like, sort of like you would in like a video game or something. Like you come up with your loadout that you're going to bring onto the mission, but they used to have to
like Resident Evil 2 or whatever in the inventory.
Yeah, they used to have to do it all by hand. And then the DARPA nerds came in and were like, well, actually, and came up with an automated system that would just like spit out a solution for the loadout they needed, and so that would reduce their deployment time a lot.
Yeah, it's a nice parlor trick. They kind of solved the knapsack problem, and this was the first instance of a human being being told what to do by a computer. It's algorithmic management from here on out, which was finally the kind of realization of DARPA's initial kind of desire for like the battlefield being managed by computers, But instead of DARPA taking this up, it's Uber that does this for like bossing people around via computer.
Yeah, just all the regulatory and algorithmic and UI ways that they try to make management as impenetrable and exploitative as possible.
Yeah, I kind of loved how they tied this all in with it's like Uber as an experience for the drivers and the passengers, right? Like has this dystopian elements, but then they also tied into this fissured workplace concept and like outsourcing and discipline at a distance and like the problems that like so that like there are related problems here of like how does Uber direct the activity of drivers in this detached algorithmic kind of way, but also how does it like how do it and similar firms direct the activity of employees in these detached ways, like through outsourcing and so on, like them. And algorithmic management is the common ground there.
Yeah, it's like how do you atomize workers as much as possible but still coordinate their activities, right?
Yes, right, and that's a general problem that is solved by this algorithmic management. And this is dark stuff. This is the kind of shit that like Norbert Wiener was afraid of in writing the human use of human beings. Like this is the kind of nightmare version of like cybernetics as a tool of capital.
Yeah, exactly. Like they open with that story about like the cabbie in New York who like sees his whole like livelihood disappear, tries to fight it, fails, and ends up killing himself. Like, you know, after having sort of written in trade journals regularly about this problem. And I remember there's actually even an episode of the old comedy show Nathan For You, which is it was like a show where Nathan Fielder, the comedian, like tries to like quote unquote help small business people with ridiculous ideas. But there's one episode where he finds a taxi driver in LA who's being screwed by Uber, and like tries to organize like a covert op to fight Uber. But then by the time he's got it organized, the driver is already working for Uber.
Oh Jesus!
It's just like, oh god,
Horrible. Yeah, he joined the human cloud. It's a wonderful little fucking phrase that they have here.
Oh, it's so gross. Like, I mean, it goes back to like that episode of like writing for delivery we did, right? But it's just this shit is so disgusting. I'm glad that like in Calgary, like speaking of sort of like co-op relevant stuff, we do have like a quite a large co-op, like consumer co-op in Calgary, which is like to some extent also a producer co-op. And they do like grocery stores. And so as of this year, they're actually doing grocery delivery. So you can get the service that Instacart provides without having to buy into the horrible worker exploitation implied by Instacart. And so, yeah, that is a very nice thing to have, thanks to co-ops, because I'm absolutely certain there's no way we'd get anything like that in the city if it weren't for the co-op.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, and yeah, I mean the nightmarish part of all this is that like it's directed by the inhuman imperatives of capital, but like I don't know, like you kind of think of like. I don't know. It's quite an achievement, right, to be able to like coordinate human labor with low latency and like all that kind of stuff. But it's like, oh, but then it's a nightmare because it's fucking capital, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like if it's just a better dispatch system you're talking about, that's nice. If it's a dispatch system that is also simultaneously like a nightmarish labor discipline demon, then it's not so cool.
No, absolutely right. There's a bit of a section then about like the kind of remarkable lack of profitability in these kind of platforms, and especially in Uber, and how this is kind of getting into like the pathologies of VC funding, and like how there's this kind of like psychotic belief that like any amount of investment today is worth it because the data genie will pay off later, right? Like it'll just be self-driving cars or AI or whatever will come out, and it's Pascal's mugging, right? Like there's an infinite utility in the future, and so you can pour all the money in today.
Yeah, there's sort of like that's the pull factor, and then the push factor is the falling rate of profit, where like the profitable investments becomes more and more and more restricted, and so then you end up making these like long shot bets through VCs on companies like Uber.
Yeah, because the rate of return on everything else is in the shitter. Yeah, and there's Tarnoff kind of frames it quite nicely here with like privatization going through these like three phases of like ascendant, triumphant, and baroque, right? Like where the ascendant phase is the privatization of the pipes, the triumphant phase is the privatization of data, and then this baroque phase is typified by Uber as like lunatic financialization and just like market psychosis.
Yeah, it's like I mean, I don't totally agree with the model because like the sort of absurd enthusiasm, the mania that's associated with Silicon Valley is something that's kind of like constantly there. Into like the .com period, and then you have like even like at sort of the height of Silicon Valley's powers, there's a lot of people saying like this stuff is overvalued, blah blah blah. And then it gets like, even more ridiculous with these just trying to appify every labor process conceivable apps. But like there's something to it, right? Like I think there's always like a baroque tendency in Silicon Valley or in capitalism in general, but especially in tech. But yeah, maybe it's only the success of Google and Facebook that have justified, and of Amazon that have justified the extremely long shot bets that are being made on things like Uber, where it's like, they lied for however many years about like, automated vehicles just around the corner, that'll make us profitable. Yeah, it's just total snake oil.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing that maybe marks this later period of it just being so much more naked than before. But again, you're right. It's always been there. It's always been a shit show. Chapter 8 is titled "Inclusive Predators," where like we really get into the cruelty and all of its effects of these platforms, and that. Like this is where Tarnoff really goes into like these internet companies as not just being tech companies. They're political machines, and they're money machines, and they're disciplinarian machines, and they're inequality machines. And all these bits are linked up. Like they're lobbying like hell to get these kinds of power and to get these kinds of investments and stuff. And that these are entanglements, right? Like each of these particular machines, like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and stuff, has a particular combination of like political and legal and financial forces like swirling around it, and that gives it its particular character. So like they all share these common kind of like common traits and tendencies that we've identified, but they all end up being a little bit different each time. But the inequality is one of those real, like being an inequality machine is kind of one of those bedrock kind of properties that these things have, right? That's what they do. One of the ways they do this is by they jilt the risk reward sort of curve. Like they externalize their risks. Like risks are pushed away and downwards, whilst rewards are pulled in and upwards. So like the example of like Uber and taxi drivers, like all of the rewards are pulled into Uber, but all of the risks and all the shittiness is pushed outwards onto taxi drivers who are getting fucked over by their livelihoods being fucked up with this stuff.
Yeah, it's like what they call like predatory inclusion. You get, it's called like the logic, organization, and technique of including marginalized consumer citizens into ostensibly democratizing mobility schemes on extractive terms, which is like, you know, basically just the capitalist labor process. But like, nevertheless, you kind of see how like Uber first destroys the taxi, the taxi drivers as like independent, kind of like guild operators, and then once they've been proletarianized, includes them in the Uber system, and like produces greater inequality through their inclusion.
Yeah, I guess the other leg of that is like so there's a deliberate demolition of your livelihood, and then you get sucked in. But then the other side of it is that like racialized workers or women or whatever are just kind of preyed upon directly. That like if you're somebody who's in a very precarious situation, you can make a bit of money as a gig worker, and that sucks you in. Or the example given here is
and that gives you like they are mobilized as the army to destroy the entrenched workers, right? Who are in relatively more privileged positions.
yeah, it's the two strokes of the engine, and I kind of like the way it's put here that like women kept at home by caregiving responsibilities can make money doing digital piecework while the baby sleeps. That's your predatory inclusion.
Yeah, just like truly classic, like putting out system, like ancient capitalism labor process stuff. In modern terms, and a lot of this like gig economy app stuff is of that sort. Like a lot of it is like reintroducing antiquated forms of labor processes into contemporary capitalism with the disciplinary apparatus of the app on top of it, right? So like
It's like it's all the shit that Marx rants about in Capital Volume 1, like of the piecework and the fucking horrible conditions and all this kind of shit. And it's just back. It's just here, you know?
yeah, like for example, like, you know, if you are a Deliveroo driver, right? Like that kind of like extremely low capital intensity delivery service is like something that you would associate more with like sort of like the late 19th century, early 20th century, right? Like, you know, highly deprofessionalized, low capital intensity, very labor intensive, very low paying. It's kind of more like something you would expect from like coolie labor or, you know, like menials or this kind of thing. Like, you know, back in the day when they would be like when the British would be like, you know, why would I possibly want a washing machine? I have servants to do that, right? Like it's like putting a very fancy veneer on top of like some of the most primitive forms of capitalist labor. Yeah.
Like, do you think we're gonna get Uber for chimney sweeps anytime soon? You know.
You know, like I bet you could hire someone on what is it, TaskRabbit to do a chimney sweeping for you.
Yeah. There's kind of a cool section then with like the way all this stuff just like replicates and remasters inequalities and oppressions, right? That like there was this kind of fantasy of the internet being this like clean place that had, you know, none of the horrible shit from the outside world was here. It's like this wonderful little utopia, but really no, it's replicated and as they put it here, like remastered, the kind of thing, right? Where it's you've got racism in HD now, right? Like, you know, it used to be analog tape and now it's digital, you know, this kind of shit. And it's transcribed into the new kind of into the new medium.
Yeah, so yeah, you get like racist exclusions that pre-existed these algorithms just being encoded into the algorithms, and then like therefore because like the algorithms are optimizing, like being intensified.
Absolutely. that then segues into, I guess, the treatment of like the far right and their presence on the internet, and how they've been, as the section is titled, innovation opportunists, and they've really made a good go of it on the internet. Like they've even like what's said here is like David Duke recognized immediately the potential for the internet. It's like, holy shit, we got to get on there, and they've been you got to hand it to them. They've been pretty savvy about getting on the trends for like new media types. They pioneered the use of talk radio and shit like that, and I'm sure they were there for the first newspapers.
Cable television, talk radio, the internet. Obviously, back in the day, radio itself. Like it's just like they will use it for propaganda as much, if not more, than the left, and they are able to do so to a greater extent. Like the more the specific medium is capital intensive or has a certain barrier to entry, the more they're able to exploit it, right? So like you have like cable where like there is no corresponding left-wing response to like Fox News, like that, like because it's like literally impossible to put something like that together with the buy-in costs that are associated with it. Like people will say like, oh, but what about CNBC? But that's all like lib shit. Like that is not
that's not
left stuff. Like it is definitely more centrist than anything else. Like they play opposition to Fox News, but that's just like the sort of dynamic of the language game they're engaged in. It's not to say that they're like that far on the political spectrum from them.
No, definitely not. And yeah, it's I think they're being the far right having more money behind them is definitely a huge factor, but like on the internet as well, you also just kind of get the impression they've just been much more savvy actors and are better at playing people and better at better at playing the game than we are for some reason.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to say because like if you're in the left milieu, you just don't see the right milieu. So like the extent to which that's like fragmented or ineffective or whatever, like we don't really have a very clear sense of that. Whereas our own problems and conflicts and whatever are very obvious to us. So I think it's like I definitely wouldn't say the left has been like totally ineffective in using these platforms or types of media. It's just the thing that's striking about the right is that like they obviously have like less numbers but are able to be quite effective for their small numbers.
Yeah, they're quite clever and deliberate about the way they go about things, I guess. That's it. They strike me as savvy, but then again, they have money as well, and like there's a certain resonance between.
Yeah, it's like they can hire whatever it is, like the Palantir. Yeah. They can hire Palantir. The left cannot hire Palantir.
No, absolutely, yeah. Oh dear. But I guess there's also a certain kind of resonance between, the kind of right radicals who are, ultimately it's a project of defending hierarchy, and like a resonance with like the hierarchy machines that are these platforms. And so they're a kind of natural fit in many ways. They kind of fit hand in glove in a way that, we're not quite so much of a fit. I wonder, is that why like podcasts are a really left-wing thing and then YouTube is a fucking right-wing hellscape? Is that why that is? Because like visual stuff is more capital intensive and podcasts are cheap as shit.
I mean, I don't know if that's like actually like I don't know what the numbers are, because like BreadTube is a thing, right? But I don't know what the relative numbers are. Like I think they must be like quite heavily weighted towards the right. But I'm not sure. It's just, yeah, I don't really feel like the left-wing YouTubers, like, their production quality is super low or anything like that. It's just, yeah, I would say, yeah, that it's certainly easier to get into the left-wing podcast game as far as, like, skills necessary to, like, production skills necessary to make a go of it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a nice kind of section then titled Beyond the Bubble, in which Tarnoff kind of sets up like a sort of popular narrative of how this whole right-wing disinformation shit goes, where it's like, oh, well, there's loads of disinformation brainwashing people, and that leads to polarization. There's, like, the Russians are involved somehow, and then there's echo chambers, and then that breeds extremism. And this is just too linear an explanation, and it's too kind of too comfortable. And he kind of takes to more explaining these things as like a complex ecosystem, right? That, like, the platforms are in an ecosystem alongside right-wing organizations and other forms of media and general kind of reactionary tendencies among people. And there's a kind of complex interaction between all these kind of things. And there's resonance and kind of symbiotic relationships there, but there's also tension and there's kind of conflict in that ecosystem as well.
Yeah, I think the main statistic he points to is that, like, polarization was actually more common among demographics that had very low internet usage than ones that had high internet usage, presumably, like, in the US. So it's like, yeah, that the internet is clearly not the causal factor in producing polarization. And the other thing he points to is that, like, you know, these, like, sort of ethnographic studies that have been done about 4chan, where they're like, well, yeah, like, it is right-wing at 4chan, but they do disagree with each other a lot. So the echo chamber hypothesis is, like, really not confirmed by the evidence. It's like yes, they're politically aligned, but they're not an echo chamber.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like you go to 4chan and you see them arguing over whether Serbians or Chechens are the master race or whatever. You know, it's like they're on the same page in some way, but it's hyper fragmented. You know.
Yeah, exactly. Or, like, is Trump based, or is Trump a useful idiot, or is Trump an enemy of the Aryan race? You know, like, these kinds of important strategic questions that come up.
So I mean, yeah, the right is a shit show also, but, like, it's a shit show with money and some degree of power. There's also kind of a gesture to, like, diversity of tactics and stuff as well amongst that kind of milieu. But I think I generally kind of appreciated the kind of ecological, like, assemblage take on this sort of stuff. That it's a complex system, and you have to treat it as non-linear. That, like, it's not just the case that, like, the right-wing media migrated onto the platforms and made them bad, or that, like, the causal flows are kind of multi-directional here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's absolutely something to these platforms being, like, outrage engines because of promoting engagement, and engagement most strongly being encouraged by outrage, which is bad. But that is not the same thing as saying it's an echo chamber, because you could be like, quite outraged, like, you know, acting from a position of like, sort of anger, and just, like, be at each other's throats as much as you could be, like, against, you know, the enemy in the whatever it is, like, the 10 minutes hate or something in Orwell, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily follow just because there's a predisposition towards outrage that there's also a predisposition towards intellectual homogeneity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and the outrage thing, outrage generating clicks is really just that, like, Facebook or whatever is optimizing for engagement, but that kind of only works so long as they don't like alienate advertisers and stuff like that. So there is a tension. So much as like Facebook is sucking up to the Republicans, they're also like trying to.
Well, it's fortunate that on the left we don't actually do anything when we get outraged, so they never really have to worry about that problem.
Yeah,
with us.
They're not trying to suck up to us more adamantly, it's but
we just get very angry.
Yeah, we seethe about it. But Facebook is trying to sucking up to the Republicans, trying to get favorable conditions for them to operate in, but also they can't afford to alienate advertisers by having too much white supremacy stuff on there. So there's tension. It's not just a one-way thing.
Yeah, he describes how it's sort of like an optimization problem where you want to be like. You want to encourage like the maximum possible amount of outrage and controversy without offending your big bourgeois advertisers who are going to get upset with you and pull your pull your funding, or the government's going to come in and give you a slap on the wrist.
Yeah, it's a complex set of feedback loops, and there are competing pressures within them. It's just good cybernetics, really.
Yeah, and the last thing he mentions is that the Russia stuff. It's like there's no the data doesn't suggest that the Russians had any appreciable effect in the disinformation and agitprop stuff they were promoting, and to the extent they did have an effect, it was just bandwagoning with right-wing memes and narratives that were already being put out by the US right. So it's they were there, but they definitely were not the powerhouse that they were made out to be.
Chapter 9, I think, is the last real chapter, Toward the Forest, which kind of gets into the techlash and kind of the general approaches to how to deal with this. The two major tendencies are identified, either reform the internet through new regulations, or reform it through more competition, breaking up the monopolies and stuff like that. But then, the third alternative that's proposed is just deprivatize the whole fucking thing, and democratize the whole thing. Which, thumbs up on the last one, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of there are there's the sort of Elizabeth Warren style alternatives that are being promoted in terms of oh, we need to break bust the trusts and create baby Facebooks and stuff to promote competition. And then he's yeah, but what if competition is even worse?
What if competition is bad, actually, Competition is the problem. This is the thing. More competition is not what you want. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then, and sort of on that note, mentioning he kind of draws on the prison abolitionist literature. In terms of sort of imagining alternatives, thinking ecologically about how they feed into each other instead of just making red Facebook. And then has this point that a key abolitionist insight is that failures of imagination produce practical failures, which is the big thing that I am always working on for work at the university. So I appreciate that point.
Yeah, I really liked this, tying in with the prison abolition stuff, the need for new architectures of you have to imagine, because if you're going to get rid of prisons, it's you have to really imagine, okay, what kind of a world would that be, and what other kind of changes would have to happen. It's not just having have a better prison or have a different prison. It's no, if they're gone, then how do you rehabilitate people? How do you support people? How do you and it goes on and on and on, and it fuels this kind of imagining of what that would actually be like, and that's so much more productive than just let's nationalize Facebook or whatever.
Yeah, and then we have a discussion about interventions in platforms as investments in care, because all of this so-called ghost work or what do you call it? Like disconnected work that is done by oppressed people in like off-site from the big tech hubs in terms of like content moderation or data entry or coding, that kind of stuff, could be understood as care work and systematically undervalued like other forms of care work, which I think is a very good point. Because yeah, I mean, it's so true. Like, care work is massively undervalued. Like pretty much any industry you look at, it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this whole last bit is a lot of proposals for ways things could go better, right? Like, could protocolize the walled gardens, kind of break them down that way. Could treat computing resources as public, kind of like the equivalent of public broadcasting, and maybe it could be rooted in libraries. There's a big server farm in every library and free access, and it kind of just it goes on through these possible ways things could be improved.
Yes. But the ultimate problem that we sort of run into with this, I think, is that because the orientation is so much towards the state, and there's no indication in like most places that the state is going to be in a position to do any of these things, it's kind of like a weird artifact of Corbynism and of Sandersism. Like it's not to say that like their politics are purely statist or purely social democratic, but there is generally that sort of thrust to it. And so it's kind of like, yeah, these are cool ideas that we could try out if we were in a better position of power versus like relative to the state. But right now we can't use them for anything. So like maybe it's a matter of like municipal government struggles to like get your library to provide some more services, but it's not like super actionable at the moment as far as I can tell. Like, it's going to depend on the country, of course, but yeah, with the way things are right now, it's quite limited.
It's hard to see how this would play out, yeah, because like I kind of think that like a lot of leftists or like social democratic sort of leftists kind of see, I don't know, they almost see the state in this kind of Schmittian kind of terms of like it's the big agent that can do anything, and if you want something done, you go to the state, you go through the state to do it. It's this kind of magical place where agency and volition comes alive. And I think that's just not the case, right? Like, I mean, you look around at, like, look at how fucking badly all states all over the world dealt with, like, the COVID crisis. I think, like, the state is where it's the elephant's graveyard where change goes to die. Like, it's not a capable actor, actually. It's like, and I think these nation state systems become more and more denatured over time and seem to. I mean, the United States government can't get fucking anything done these days. Like, what makes anyone think they're going to fucking reform libraries, It's the elephant's graveyard where stuff goes to die. It's not the place you go to get things done.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the pandemic, like, it definitely showed how, like, the degree of coordination that the state has available to it is required, but it didn't suggest that, like, the state was very good at making use of that, Like, it was like, yeah, like, you definitely need to be more coordinated than the, like, U.S. sort of, like, everything is federalized, devil take the hindmost approach, right? Of just like, I don't know, y'all figure it out, we don't care anymore. But yeah, a lot of the responses were really clumsy and ineffective or compromised by like business interests putting tons of pressure on the government. Like it was definitely wasn't a slam dunk in favor of the state, even though it pointed to the need for wide scale coordination beyond just like personal or neighborhood level stuff, right?
Well, yeah, it certainly points to the necessity, and I think this is the thing that like we carry in our hearts this desire for like social coordination, and then imagine that the state could provide it. But like, I think if you look honestly at how these things perform and have performed more recently, there are machines that are flooded with entropy and have less and less capability over time, and can't seem to get fucking anything done. Like even the most basic stuff can't get done. And that seems to be true across the board. Like any nation state you can name seems to have this problem by now. And so the desire is there, you know, but like I think this is it's kind of like us. Like as leftists, we kind of have like it's like imprinting. You know that horrible experiment that was done with like a baby monkey where they like took away its mother and then they gave it like a straw. They gave it a straw doll. Right, they gave it a straw doll that kind of looked like a mother, and it just latched onto it and basically acted as if the straw doll was its mother, even though functionally it was not in any fucking way a mother, right? But the problem was the baby monkey had a mother-shaped hole in its heart, and the doll vaguely, almost kind of resembled something that could fill that hole, and so it did. And it's a functional imprinting thing, and I think as leftists, like, you know, we're people who care. Like we have this like ethical or moral imperative to like try and make a better world. And I think we have a care-shaped hole in our hearts that makes us imprint on the state as this. The state is the straw doll here that is non-functional. Like it won't provide the things we want, but we have a hole in our hearts that makes us think it does. And I think that's what's going on in a lot of these cases. That like the desire is certainly there, and like yeah, the COVID crisis tells us like we fucking need social coordination, but I don't know. My instincts just tell me that's not what you're going to get out of the nation state. Like that's not a machine that does that. It's a straw doll. It's not your mother. You know.
Yeah. I think the point about sort of like these hub institutions and so on, and the value that they can have, I think is well taken. And building those up to whatever extent is possible to provide an alternative is a good idea. But like as Tarnoff describes, like the ISPs and big tech firms do fight these things like one by one. They try to like whack-a-mole crush them and create the regulatory environment that will like take all the oxygen out of the room for them. So like it's, you can kind of get under the radar to some degree with them, or maybe you have like a sympathetic administration like with Biden where it's kind of like, yeah, I don't know, it seems like a good idea, I guess. Where it's, you're not going to be actively attacked by the state in the way that say like Trump might have done. But yeah, like, we need coordination. We need coordination, and it's like, I can see how these hub institutions can provide that at the local level, but then how do we coordinate across those? That's still the big question.
Well, it needs a social movement and social force that would, you know, if you have that kind of force on your side, it's like the problem of the general strike. Like if you have a social force that can do that kind of strike, why not just take over the fucking world? You know, like just go do the thing. You know, so like if you have the kind of social force that could actually make anchor institutions work, you've got the kind of social force that could just dismantle the fucking government immediately. You know, that's the kind of bar you'd be trying to reach there. You know.
Yeah, and I think like in the case of like the internet, like you're never really going to get a situation in the US where the internet, like people could hate the ISPs more. Like they're so widely hated. Like there is like, you kind of have hit the ceiling in terms of dissatisfaction. So like theoretically there should be some basis for coordination there, but you're just up against a ton of money, and that's the eternal problem. And like, yeah, maybe you can make alliances with the big tech firms to some degree. You can make alliances with the Democrats to some degree, but like ultimately they don't give a shit about you. So, yeah, like I guess you just have to like fight the local fight and try to fight the regulatory fight whenever it's possible.
Yeah, and like the author does call for like organization from below and like just gestures to revolution basically. But like, it's hard to it's hard for me to square like kind of revolutionary upsurge from below with also like asking the state to give grants to libraries and stuff. Like it's
Yeah, I mean it's the classic problem with like sort of the like Richard Wolff program for socialism in America, right? Like we'll build socialism on co-ops that are funded by the state. I don't know. It doesn't seem very likely to me.
we're back in LaSalle town, it's
Oh, it's 100% LaSalle town, but it's like, yeah, based on what precedent would you ever think that would happen? Where it's like, it's not just a little bit of anti-competition, it's like, we're going to undermine the entire capitalist economy.
yeah, right. Like it's the audacity of the plan here is remarkable, but like it's if you're challenging the whole contemporary capitalist economy at this level, you're fucking challenging it like outright. It's not just the internet part of it you're challenging. And for the listeners who haven't followed us on this LaSalle thing that we keep referring to, Ferdinand Lassalle was a kind of contemporary of Karl Marx who his version of socialism was this weird thing where like, oh, I'm gonna ask Bismarck to team up with the workers to do socialism to like take down the capitalists or some fucking crazy shit like that. But it's
Yeah, work with the crown against the capitalists was kind of the agenda, and he was the founder of the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party. So very very important figure. Basically, the figure that like won out in terms of what official Marxism became. Yeah, and Marx had critiques of him in the Critique of the Gotha program, but he like suppressed his own critiques in the name of party unity. So like even his disagreements with Lassalle were not well known until quite a bit later.
yeah. So the thing that is known as Marxism is more accurately called Lassalleanism, really.
Yeah, and that applies like equally sort of like spin-offs like, you know, social democracy is very Lassallean. Basically, whenever you see the state as like your big friend who's going to come beat up the bully, that is basically the Lassallean program. If that's your strategy, that's Lassalleanism. And it is like a gradualist thing as well and that kind of thing. But really, it's about identifying socialism with the state, which is a thing like prior to Lassalle was generally not popular among socialists. And sort of becomes popular with the SPD and the party institutionalization of socialism and Marxism in the later 19th century.
Yeah, Lassalle was the monkey who thought the straw doll was her mom. It's fucking crazy.
Yeah, Bismarck is my mom.
Just imprinted on this fucking thing. Anyway, the conclusion is titled "Future Nostalgia," in which Tarnoff kind of takes down some of these like nostalgic notions of the internet as like, oh, there was an early internet which was great, and then all the fucking plebs came along and stuff. Like, no, that was all horrible and exclusionary. But he does kind of it takes on like some nostalgia is useful, basically like that. If we're looking back in order to look forward, that's quite good. So like,
yeah, he basically does the poetry of the past thing that Marx criticizes in the 18th Brumaire, saying like, well, the French Revolution had to dress up like Romans to do their thing, but what does it look like to to have a revolution based on the poetry of the future, and Tarnoff's kind of saying like, well, you need a little bit of past looking nostalgia as well, at the very least, is what he's saying.
Yeah. The historical example he leans on is that of the Luddites, who were rebelling against the new way of being and the new way of working with an eye towards, like, they had personal experience of having not lived that way, you know. So they were able to look backwards to say, hey, this sucks, and maybe in the future things could be better. So nostalgia can be good if it leads to inspiration, but is a reactionary trap if it doesn't.
The problem is where, like, I mean, ideally you want to have, like, you know, creative imagination that is creating the poetry of the future. But if you're going to engage in nostalgia, like, you don't want to replicate perceived solutions from the past just because you conceive of the past as being more desirable. So I think a lot about, like, the sort of, like, we'll engineer our way out of the problem responses that you get among the, like, open source crowd and that kind of thing. Where it's like, you know, because there was, like, hacker freedom in the early internet, hacker freedom is powerful and a potential solution to the problem that we are experiencing, and we're motivated by our nostalgia to do it.
There's a nice line here where it's like, movements are made of both creativity and coercion. So, like, I mean, Tarnoff is saying that, like, that there needs to be some sort of movement that is able to coerce these things into being. But I mean, we've been over a lot of that. And he kind of finishes up on a wrap up of the book, like that. You know, the book has been laying out the story of this privatization, and understanding how privatization made the modern internet is essential for any movement that seeks to remake it, because you have to know your enemy. You have to know that the enemy is privatization / capital.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's basically capital. I mean, like, privatization is sort of the dynamic that unfolded from the beginning of the internet to the present, but yeah, it's probably not the most significant one. It's like, you know, it's like earlier in the book he talks about, like, formal versus real subsumption, where, like, formal is you take a non-capitalist labor process and put it under capitalist ownership, and then real subsumption is where the labor process is actually materially and structurally changed to be amenable to capital. And it's kind of more the subsumption process, the, like, creation of these ideas of platforms, the ideas of data exploitation, of creating these, like, ways to simultaneously, like, atomize and coordinate the labor process. That kind of stuff is really the useful thing that we're learning here from this history, more so than privatization sucks, doesn't it? Yeah, I think that's kind of what I take away, at least in terms of the key value.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I think all that stuff is really interesting and really good to bring to light. And it's the word privatization just doesn't really capture all of that. Actually, like, there's a lot of stuff going on there that's, like, I don't know, not really. It's not captured by that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's sort of like post privatization developments that make it, like, way more obnoxious and anti-human.
Yeah. It's yeah. That's a good way of putting it, right? Like, it's once you've arrived in full capitalism, what happens next is the kind of interesting development. Whereas, yeah, privatization is a sort of understood thing. But yeah, like, I mean, who would have predicted algorithmic management and the particular perversities of the human cloud just based on the process of privatizing something? You know, it's all, there's a lot of weird shit that falls out.
Yeah, like, kind of wiener, but also kind of not. You know, like, he definitely had an inkling of where this might be going. Yeah.
But it is good history of all those elements. I think it's definitely worth a read. And yeah, I enjoyed it quite a bit.
Yeah. And I would like probably, if I was, say, teaching a course on this subject, like, history of communication, like I used to teach or whatever, I would probably assign this book as like a, first year primer on the subject. It's worth reading. If you are looking for a sort of to the point history that isn't going to get too bogged down in minutia.
Yeah, exactly. It's a breezy read. It is not a difficult read at all. Yeah, I don't know. Do we have anything else to say before we wrap up on that?
No, I don't think so. I think it's I guess I'm glad that we have addressed a proper this is the history of the internet book at this point, given that we've kind of done articles or videos or whatever, but never just a history of the internet. And now we've covered it.
Yeah, it's I was kind of surprised it took us this long to do this, but it's always been kind of ambient knowledge on the show, I guess.
And the other ones that are out there are maybe not quite as good for what we are doing here. So yeah, I appreciate it from that angle for sure.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, listeners, for coming along with us on this one, as always. While you wait for the next episode, you can catch us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on the internet at generalintellectunit.net. I was going to try to make some joke about the content of the book relating to the internet, but whatever, it got away from me. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we're on all the podcast apps, so subscribe and download some other episodes. If you'd like to get access to our community Discord, where we chat about this kind of stuff with the community, you can go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit. Give us a couple of bucks a month and you'll get access, and you'll help to support the show, help to pay for books, all that kind of good stuff. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. So if you go to emancipation.network and check out that website, you'll get links to all the other shows, such as Jumpsuit Utopia, Swampside Chats, Mortal Science, and From Alpha to Omega. They're all fantastic. They're all slightly different, and I don't know, but they're all similar, I guess. We have similar vibes,
Yes, we still have that forthcoming book on communist planning from Tom, so that should be an interesting overlap with what we do here on the show once it comes out.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we need to catch up with them and see when that's happening. We'll get them on to talk about it. Yeah, that'll be good fun.
Yeah, and I think we will probably do a little bit more. I've had requests from listeners to sort of do a little bit more fiction or something more narrative oriented. So hopefully we'll get to do a little bit of that in the winter here.
Yeah. Ooh, I've got one to propose for you there. I might edit this out. William Gibson's The Peripheral. Have you read that?
Oh, I haven't read it, but I've heard of it. Yeah.
It's really fucking good. We should maybe do that, because there's actually an Amazon show coming out, an adaptation coming out in the next couple of months. So if we read the book, we could... Yeah, fuck it, let's do that. Yeah, it's a really good novel.
It's been a long time since I've read some William Gibson, so...
Yeah. Yeah. It's it is a really good novel. Yeah, let's do that next. So if you're listening to this, maybe you might get a chance to read that novel first before we get to it in a month's time. Yeah, fun. That'll be good. Nice breezy change of pace. It's been years since I read it, so I remember it being very good. But let's see how it holds up.
Let's see how it holds up, yeah.
Fun. Well, yeah, if that's everything, thanks again, listeners, and we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.